Webb.
I'm your host, Ricardo Brandez. ¿Cómo estás, everybody? We have a great episode for you. We're going to talk about something that we're all, I'm sure, super deep into. The Jeffrey Epstein story. We go really deep into the history with what has become the leading researcher and expert in the Jeffrey Epstein case and story, Whitney Webb, who works for MintPress News. I'll put links to her social media accounts, her articles on MintPress News and all that stuff in the show description on our YouTube channel. So please check that out. Our YouTube channel is RV Theory 6, or just look up the Ripple Effect Podcast and you'll find it. And like I said, I'll put links to all her stuff there. I'll also have links to my Patreon page if you want to support the show. If you do, then you'll be the first to know about any future guests. Once I book a guest, you'll be the first to be notified. But more important than that, spread these conversations, because stories like this are super important. So when people talk about the Franklin scandal, when they talk about the Reagan and Bush administration having a call boy and little boys being raped, and Dennis Hastert and all this drug trafficking and human trafficking and all this stuff is going to sound much more realistic and much more possible when people spread this Epstein story, which is undeniable, and making the most skeptical of people start to believe and rethink what they thought they knew. And I think that's what makes this story possibly the JFK of our time, or the 9/11 of our time, because 9/11 completely changed my perspective on the world and made me rethink what I thought I knew. And I think this story is doing the same for a lot of people. So we need to spread these conversations, spread Whitney Webb's stories, her articles, her interviews. She's really one of the people who've done the most research into the story, and there's just so much there that's undeniable. It's people can speculate about, did DC Madam kill herself or not? Did Danny Castellero? Did Gary Webb? You can speculate all that stuff, but it's so obvious with Jeffrey Epstein that there's more to the story. That, like I said, I think it's making the most skeptical people conspiracy theorists, for lack of a better term, and I think it's a good thing, because these elite are truly believe that they're elite, that they're above us, that we're just pawns, and it's something that people have been saying for a long time in the alternative media, but you're starting to see that that's true, and it's starting to become much more obvious. So I think that the story is so important, and also just all this pedophilia and all this stuff that just, it's so horrific that it's hard to believe. Now I think people are going to start believing this stuff. These political assassinations, I think it's going to become more believable. I think all this stuff is going to become more believable because of the fact that this one story, it's so obviously bullshit, and there's such a cover up. Why is Maxwell still out there? Why isn't she brought in? Why is all his stuff not raided, his house raided and all this stuff, to be able to expose who was a part of this, who was he working for, who was he working with, all this stuff, what type of creepy sexual stuff he was into. Sometimes growing up, when I was getting really into alternative media, you hear stories about Skull and Bones, you hear stories about all these secret societies, Bohemian Grove, all this stuff, and all these weird rituals, and it just seems like, no, that seems too weird, but does it? And does it now? Because I think people are rethinking what's possible, and I like I keep saying, that I think this story is super important, and because the story is super important, that means Whitney's research is even more important. So please support her, support shows like this that are willing to have these conversations. I think that's it. So follow me, do all that stuff, support people like Whitney Webb, and spread this story and spread this information. Peace. I believe overnight you've become like the leading expert in the Epstein case, and I've heard you everywhere, and everybody's trying to get you, and everybody's referring to your work.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I'm glad people are paying attention to it, but at the same time, I don't know. I've been writing about a lot of other stuff for a couple years, and there are people that were writing on the Epstein case, in 2007 stuff before me. I guess I just, by chance got my hands on an angle that I thought was, fresh on it, that turned out to be really, of great interest to a lot of people. So I'm really happy that worked out. But, I honestly am just glad that the information's getting out there more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I've heard you on Fault Lines quite a few times, even before, and I know you've been a journalist and writing for a long time. And I mean, this is good because I think anytime somebody has, I mean, it's almost like James Corbett and his 9/11 video that went viral. It was a short. It was a short.
The conspiracy theory one.
Yeah. It was a short little video. I mean, obviously he doesn't. He's done so much work that it's like he probably doesn't want to be known for that one short little video. But if it brings more people to his website and more attention to his work, then I think that's what's going on too with like MintPress. You guys have been around for a while, and it's all of a sudden everybody's talking about MintPress. Oh, there's these articles, there's this writer, this journalist, and your name's coming up back to back on different shows and stuff like that. So, I
haven't noticed that as much as some other people maybe, because I've been just so stuck in this work and trying to like juggle home life and finishing up this series and all these interviews and stuff. So that's awesome that people are talking about it. I'm really glad that I could, produce something that's been a real conversation starter for some people. That is really nice to hear.
Yeah, I just had Jason Burmis on, but he was on Tinfoil Hat podcast recently, and this just recently too. I think it was like the same day we recorded both episodes. He did both interviews, and he brought up your work when they were doing an episode on the Epstein case. And then you look at I was just listening to Media Roots, Abby Martin's show, and they just brought up your work. So it's cool. I mean, it's awesome because I hear you. Like when you do a lot of work that you think is important, it's like, wait, this is getting all the attention and all my other stuff's getting neglected. But it's
no, but I don't care if it gets neglected. I'm just kind of surprised that people were so interested. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was interesting, but I didn't really expect this kind of response. But it's awesome.
Well,
I guess.
I wonder, it was funny because I was on Fault Lines. I called in like a week ago or whenever it was, and Lee and I have been going, but he's actually from the same area that I'm from, so I've been trying to get him on the show for a little bit and just trying to schedule stuff. But I'm like, let me just call in, and I was talking about how I almost feel like this Epstein case is our JFK moment. It's like
he said that today.
Oh, he did?
I went on Fault Lines today, and that's literally exactly like verbatim what he said.
Really? I was listening to it in the background.
Did you say that to him?
Yeah, I did like a week ago, and I called in and I said that to him. How
well, he agrees with you now.
Yeah, well, that's good then. Yeah, I heard you on there today. I think you were like on the 9 o'clock hour, on our time, and it was I was listening to it in the background, but I missed that because I would have pointed out. I'm like, oh crap, he probably got that from me when I mentioned that. But I do think it's similar to that because so many people who are skeptical, so many people who don't believe that there's all this collusion and conspiracies, that all of it's kind of BS and just Alex Jones connecting the dots type stuff. And
yeah, but Alex Jones is the one blaming the Chinese for Epstein.
Of course, yeah.
But I don't know if I'd include him here.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is like a lot of people, anytime they hear something, it's like that's what every story that seems a little far-fetched for the average person, that's what they kind of compare it to. It's like, oh, it's just like Alex Jones says this and says that, and And now it's like it's so obvious that there's more to the story, that this guy had links to so many different people, and it's so obvious that there's more to the story. You know, when in regards to his suicide, that even the most skeptical person can't deny that there's something going on, that he was probably taken out, or maybe they let him commit suicide or whatever. But either way, there's a lot to his background and who he's linked to, and there's a huge cover up going on. And I think it's a good thing, because I think in future stories, maybe when people read a headline or when you talk to somebody about something, it becomes much more believable. You know, if you're talking about possibly, you know, well, you live in Chile, right? So, yeah. Do you speak any Spanish? Fala en español? Oh yeah. That's awesome.
I mean, my boyfriend doesn't speak any English, so and my kid's bilingual, so. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm Portuguese, and I was born in Portugal, so you know, speaking two languages to me, I think.
Oh, cool. Well, I don't speak Portuguese, but you know, I used to bartend in Santiago some, and there'd be a lot of Brazilian tourists that would come in, and I could sort of understand.
Yeah, it is very. I have a lot of Spanish friends, and it's weird. Like, they have a harder time understanding me than I have them, but I think it's because Spanish is a very popular language, so you kind of know what it sounds like. And
Portuguese sounds different. That's true.
Yeah. So it is weird, because even anytime you see Portuguese and Spanish people together, it's like we always understand them, but they don't understand us. But it's I think being bilingual is awesome. My wife's Italian, but she's kind of, you know, was raised in America, so she doesn't really, you know, she didn't pick up any of the language. And my kids, I'm always concerned about, like, hey, are they going to pick up any Portuguese? Can we kind of, you know, get them to speak Portuguese? And luckily they're with my parents from time to time, and they only speak Portuguese. So it kind of, more than likely they're going to be able to understand it, and they're not going to really pick up on speaking it much. But even that alone, I think, is a good thing. And they say kids who are bilingual, they do better in school, they learn better. And I also think you connect with people differently too. Yeah.
That would be nice.
Yeah. And you connect with people differently. When you meet somebody, I'm sure, like, you know, when you speak English, I mean, you don't have any accent whatsoever. I would never even guess that you spoke fluent Spanish. And I'm sure the second you speak to somebody in Spanish, they open up to you. You know, all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, you know, it's like people. It's a weird thing where, like, when somebody speaks your native tongue, they just open up to you. I've been to restaurants where, you know, I find out that the waiter or the cook is Portuguese, and next thing you know, I'm talking to them in Portuguese, and all of a sudden they're way more friendlier than they were when they thought I was, you know, American. So it's I think it's a cool thing. But yeah, to go back to this Epstein thing, do you feel like it is like the JFK assassination? Like it's gonna just,
you know, I think it's similar, but I think it's bigger, because here's the thing.
Wow.
When JFK died, a lot of people had there's suspicions that something was going on, but, you know, there wasn't the internet then. The flow of information was a lot more controlled than it is today. And so I think the fact that there's a similar situation, like a similar death and similar, you know, a cover up happening in real time, that's raising eyebrows for people that normally don't, you know, think about conspiracies, like you said. But because of the internet, and even there's a lot of censorship on YouTube now and social media, it still spreads in a way that's very different. You know, the media's landscape is different than it was, in the 1960s or even, a few decades ago. So I think that's what makes this bigger, because there's a better opportunity to sort of spread different opinions about this around. And it's become really clear, especially in the past few days, you know, that mainstream media is really rolling with the official suicide thing. The narrative's already being set up that the Bureau of Prisons is going to be taking the fall for all of this, and Bill Barr, you know, is going to be covering all this up, because that's what Bill Barr does. That's what he's done his whole career, is just cover things up. So I think a lot more people have the opportunity to sort of have access to alternative explanations that are more convincing than the official story, than maybe they did in the 1960s, when most people were getting their news from television and there wasn't, the internet didn't exist in the form that it exists today then, right? So I think that's why I say this may be bigger, but I also think it's important to point out too that the same, some of the same networks and individuals that were involved in Kennedy's death. I haven't really done this in my reporting, but anyone that's investigated, JFK's assassination themselves will notice that there's a lot of overlap between the the organized crime syndicates and all of that in intelligence that I talk about in my reporting, and a lot of overlap between that and the forces that were ultimately responsible for the Kennedy assassination, right? So it's interesting to see a lot of the same players go, back in the 60s when I'm talking about, sort of the genesis of this network where Epstein, I guess you could say, came from, and how, that developed over time, and how a lot of those activities that they were involved in, including sexual blackmail, proliferated and led us to where we are today. Now we have a different figure who was one of their own, by all appearances, being being involved in this suspicious death, or some would say, he was swapped out. I mean, who really knows? Because there's no transparency. But I think there is a lot of overlap between the two cases. And so I think that's a really valid comparison. And I also think because of the extent of Epstein's network, it's going to lead people down various rabbit holes that they may have not arrived at before, or, certain topics of discussion they may have avoided, thinking there's no way that could be happening. But the craziness just in and of itself of the admitted facts of the Epstein case may have made them think, well, this may sound crazy, but everything going on with Epstein's nuts. So, maybe I'll give this another look. So I think, that's an apt analogy, and I really hope that the internet and the historic lack of trust in mainstream media that we're seeing right now in the U.S. especially will really help disseminate information that's been suppressed by the mainstream for a long time, and help that get to a new audience, and hopefully make a change.
Yeah. Well, I had Nick Bryan on a few years ago, who wrote the Franklin Scandal, and naturally, we also brought up Jeffrey Epstein, and this story's been going on for a while. And I remember talking to people about it, and they kind of like just poo-pooed it, like, yeah, that sounds a little far-fetched, or that sound like nobody ever really seemed like they believed me that much. Like it seemed a little far-fetched, and now it's like it's on every single station. It's on and I've kind of bounced this off James recently. I've bounced this off Sam Tripoli. I had a couple guests on the last couple weeks where I kind of asked them, because I'm kind of curious, and I don't know what your opinion is. It's this Epstein story, like you said, people have been reporting on this for a long time. It's been around for a long time. He's been accused of stuff for a long time. He's not like a new character, but all of a sudden it seems like media has gotten this green light to talk about it. And before it was like, I feel like there's still, even though we have more information now on his background and stuff like that, and there's more people connecting dots, but even before, there was enough there to make for a good story and for a really interesting story, because this guy was, linked to obviously people that are in the public eye, like Trump and Clinton and stuff like that, and yet it seemed like nobody would talk about it. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, everybody's talking about it after the Miami Herald did the story. Do you think it was just as simple as with the Miami Herald doing the story, it just got enough attention?
No way. No, I mean, I think the reporting was good, but the more you look at how power is wielded in the U.S. and the type of things they actually prosecute, I don't think that is what led them to arrest Epstein. What I think happened, and we can get more into this later, is after his arrest in 2007 and all of that, I think after he got out of prison, he didn't really continue the sexual trafficking that he had been, more or less busted for. I think he did continue activities that he'd been doing for years prior that involved things like money laundering and other sort of shady financial dealings, if you will. And I think part of that had to do what was done in conjunction with, for the CIA and some other things, because, well, I'll be in my new report that's coming out, I'm going to be talking about some links between Epstein and BCCI and how this sort of activity he's been doing for a long time. But what I think is interesting is that a month before, or really just 2 weeks before this Miami Herald report came out, there was a new policy put in place I think the nickname for it that's most often used is like Statement 56. And it's sort of this new policy about financial statements by the federal government, where basically the government is now allowed to have a public statement that's a lie, basically, about its finances, and a private statement that's accurate, right? And before then, and so that essentially gives, what started with the CIA Act of 1949, which gave the CIA permission to sort of pilfer funds from different agencies in the government at will to fund its black ops and its black budget and what have you. Now they can just do that with impunity anywhere they want, so they don't really need people that are laundering money or acting as fronts, or financial fronts for intelligence. And I think that Epstein was doing a lot of that work, and that the combination of that policy being put into place, making him, more or less useless, in that sense, are not really needed anymore, I guess you could say. And then perhaps the combination of the Miami Herald report, may have contributed to that and made it easier to take him down because he wasn't necessary then. And I also think a factor here, and I'm not, 100% sure on what he was doing with Deutsche Bank because no one really knows, but it wasn't until December of last year, after this new policy was enacted in October, and after the Miami Herald story came out, that Deutsche Bank claimed that it was starting to close accounts related to Epstein, but those accounts were not completely closed until June, which is, of course, a month before his arrest. So I think the real reason he was arrested likely has something to do with what was going on with Deutsche Bank. He was known to be moving money out of the country in large amounts, using that bank specifically. And, allegedly more information is going to come out as Deutsche Bank investigates itself, but who can really trust, a self-investigation from a bank as corrupt as Deutsche Bank? Plus, Deutsche Bank is in deep trouble right now, right? So I think there may be some connection there. But honestly, the Miami Herald, that report basically exposed, the fraud that was that sweetheart deal and how corrupt it was. But those sorts of deals go on in the U.S. all the time. And when it involves someone really powerful and someone who received that deal because they belong to intelligence, as Alex Acosta said, I mean, they would just, the real halls of power, would just ignore that story, I would think. So I definitely think there was another factor here, and I think it may have been what I just laid out, this whole, financial aspect. But, there's also another angle that I think is also plausible, and that has to do actually with infighting between the mega group and, other factions of power within, Israel and the Jewish diaspora, in the sense that the mega group was really connected to Epstein through people like Leslie Wexner and Ronald Lauder. And in recent years, and also Epstein was really close to Ehud Barak, who was currently Netanyahu's opponent in the upcoming elections. Netanyahu is, of course, facing all these corruption charges, including bribery and other things. And it wasn't until Epstein was arrested that Netanyahu got all this great political fodder to attack his main opponent for being, besties, basically, with a convicted pedophile and accused sex trafficker. And that, of course, makes bribery accusations not look so bad, right? And anyway, I bring up Wexner and Lauder also because in recent years and months, they've, rebuked Netanyahu, and in Wexner's case have rebuked Trump. So going after Epstein and attacking Epstein, or rather attacking the people close to Epstein, is definitely something that affects people like Leslie Wexner, who are Netanyahu's political enemies. So some people have argued that the timing of Epstein's arrest in July may have had something potentially to do with benefiting Netanyahu's reelection chances, because Trump has basically endorsed Netanyahu in the upcoming elections. He did that previously with the prior elections in, I believe, April. And so some have suggested that the decision to prosecute Epstein at this time may have been sort of like a favor in that sense, and sort of killing two birds with one stone, going after some. Or sort of sending a strong message to people like Wexner to get in line behind people like Trump and people like Netanyahu, instead of publicly rebuking them, which I think is interesting, an interesting possibility. So I think there's a couple different plausible theories as to why this was going on now. But generally speaking, I don't think it was the Miami Herald story in and of itself that led to someone, as connected as this guy, having federal charges brought against him. I also think another potential angle here is the fact that someone wanted the blackmail that Epstein had in his possession that was stored on these hard drives that were found in these safes and on the electronic devices found at his residences. Now all of that is basically in the hands of the FBI, and it's interesting. Now that Epstein is dead or whatever, the criminal case against him is gone, and that means that all of that evidence, including that blackmail that was acquired, will never have to be made public. But someone has it, right? And given how the U.S. government works, and the FBI works and has historically worked, going back to J. Edgar Hoover and whatnot, they like to use blackmail for their own personal, for their own interests as an agency. So it'll be, I think that may have been another factor here as well. But, a lot of this, unfortunately, has to be speculative just because of how untransparent the whole affair has been.
I'm so glad you gave me that answer, because I thought I've been going crazy, because I bring it up to Corbett, I bring it up to a few people, and everybody's saying the same thing. Oh, we just think that like all the evidence is just piled up, and that's why it's all over the news. I'm like, you went from this guy, who obviously was doing some shady stuff, and he was being accused of a bunch of stuff, and he ended up going to prison, getting this sweetheart deal. Like, all this stuff was kind of known, and it was completely suppressed from the media. Like, nobody was talking about it whatsoever. And then all of a sudden, and we know Operation Mockingbird, right? Obviously,
right.
And we also, there's a great documentary, Shadows of Liberty, Out Fox, which is another one that these are all talking about how like the media can be controlled and manipulated, and stories are suppressed and edited a certain way. So it's like, we know this stuff happens all the time, and to me, like, if this guy's linked to this many high-ranked and powerful people, there's no way that they don't have friends in high places who can make sure these stories aren't on front page news and headline news and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, it was on Today's show. It was like the most mainstream of stuff. It was on the morning shows. It was on every show you could think of. Everybody was talking about Jeffrey Epstein, and it to me that seemed really unusual, because so your theories, on what could be causing all of a sudden this change of heart where nobody was talking about this. And like we talked about, like, people have been reporting on this Epstein story for a long time. He's not a new character. He's been accused of a bunch of stuff for years, and nobody's even mentioned him in mainstream media. And all of a sudden it's like, we got the green light to talk about it. And everybody can accuse him and talk about, speculate this and talk about this and that. And it's, it also, I was thinking maybe it could be some for political motivation. Maybe they were trying to link him to Trump or link him to Clinton, because if just trying to, I guess, if they're your
right. Well, I think that's possible too. But his connections are so bipartisan, it's hard to argue that it was just one party, right?
Yep.
But I think if anything, if it was done for that reason, it would have been to exacerbate the divisive political climate in the U.S. today. Because what we've seen a lot since this case broke is that, partisan left outlets and partisan right outlets have been saying Epstein Trump or Epstein Clinton, right? And have been trying to sort of convince their readership that this is a partisan thing, and sort of using this to sort of exacerbate the divide. So if it was done for that reason, I think it would have just been to increase the divisiveness and that sort of rhetoric, and sort of entrench the two camps on either side. But I think at the same time too, though, a lot of at least thinking people in the U.S. have noticed that it's bipartisan, which I think is positive in the sense that maybe people that were, sort of focused on, partisan aspects of corruption and whatnot may have had an opportunity now to see that this is definitely something that transcends political party, right? But if it was done for domestic political purposes, I think it just would have been to increase this sort of divisive climate that we see in the U.S. right now that's really, grown exponentially ever since the 2016 election.
Yeah, I remember sharing stories that linked, a Republican to Epstein, and people are like, "Oh, how about you talk about Clinton?" Then I'd share a story about his link to Clinton, and people are like, "How about you talk about Trump?" And it's like,
yeah, I've gotten that too. That's just how it is, I guess.
It's so silly. It's like, why? like you said, I think a lot of thinking people have realized that this isn't about politics. You know, I get people ask me all the time, like, "Oh, what are you? Do you lean right?" And I'm like, I look at ideas, and the ones that make the most sense, so those are the ones I subscribe to. And it doesn't matter which side it comes from or who said it. You know, I was a fan of Dennis Kucinich when he was in, you know, politics. I was a fan of Ron Paul when he was in politics. You know, I've been a Ralph Nader, Ross Perot. I mean, there's tons of people that have said things that I like, that I would say, yeah, like this person, you know, I like these ideas coming from this person, you know. So anytime you box yourself in, it just, I feel like humans should be much more complex in the way they look at things, and you shouldn't just fit into some little box where you agree with every in every. I just heard a honking from outside. Sorry, it got my attention. If you agree with this one party on everything, then are you really doing any of your own thinking? And I think that's the issue. And that's why this story, you know, I love the fact that it's linked to both parties and people on both sides. And because I hope people realize that, like, ideology has nothing to do with it. It's about money and power. And it doesn't,
yeah, totally.
You know, it's like that movie Network. I don't know if you remember that from like the late 70s, I think, early 70s. And, you know, that movie Network where, you know, he talks about being mad as hell. Did I lose you?
Corta la señal.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah. Okay.
Am I back?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. If you want, I can just go to town. I have to get my daughter after this anyway, so it's like really not a big deal, and that way we won't keep getting cut off. But I guess now if it's okay, we can try.
Yeah. If it goes down again, then I guess we can you know.
Okay. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, it's all right. I mean,
it normally doesn't cut out. The last time this happened was like 3.5 weeks ago, I think. Was the last time. So.
Yeah, no problem. Don't worry about it. But
really
yeah. Oh, it's all right. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, so I've had a lot of guests where they've had a horrendous, you know, internet or use phone lines. There's still people who still like to use landlines, you know. So it's, which I guess it does bypass, you know, any internet issue. So I guess it's not the worst thing. But yeah, I definitely think that it's what the hell was I talking about? I was trying to buy myself time while I was gathering my thoughts.
No, we were talking about how this is about wealth and power and not about ideology, and how sometimes ideology can be an influence, but in this case, it doesn't seem to be, you know, necessarily based on ideology.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. But you know, if you want to go with the theory that I mentioned earlier about like factional infighting in like the mega group and stuff like that, you know, then ideology, you know, would play a role there, I think. But you know, it's relatively minor on the bigger scale of what Epstein was doing. But I think a lot of times, you know, when you look at the structure of the power elite, you know, just globally, you know, they don't always agree. They have, you know, their disagreements, and they have their, like, you know, internal battles, as it were. So I think, you know, when those sorts of factional fights happen, then ideology is a factor, but not in the way that people would normally think about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, well, you look at it, people say that America's a Christian country, but yeah, we have no problem doing business with, you know, Israel. We have no problem doing business with Saudi Arabia. We have no problem doing, you know, people who have different philosophies and different perspectives and different ideologies. So I definitely think that if it can help them, then I don't think ideology will be the deal breaker. You know, they'll kind of look past that. But so in regards to Epstein, I mean, there's so many crazy things to this story, and some of it just seems like almost too crazy to be real, because you're like, this is already a crazy story. Then you find out about him trying to spread his seed through a bunch of women and his
eugenics interest. But I think that's actually good that story came out, because it's something, you know, it highlights the fact that eugenics is still, you know, of interest to people in the American elite. And actually, you know, if you look at the history of eugenics in the United States, it was actually, you know, prominent Americans and wealthy Americans that sort of, dominated that movement, especially in the early 20th century, with like the Rockefellers and families, powerful families like that, that were very heavily promoting eugenics. And there were actually several states that adopted eugenics laws. There were Supreme Court rulings, in the 20s, for example, that were, about eugenics and about sterilizing people based on, their perceived intelligence by the government. And things like that went on, and of course that fell out of favor, obviously, during World War II for what I think should be obvious reasons. But the fact that, people like Epstein were interested in science, in genetics specifically, for the purpose of, because of this interest of eugenics and sort of creating like a superior human race and all this stuff, should really, I hope anyway, will, help people to realize that the American elite, there's many of them still think this way, years later, that this, it may have changed form or sort of gone underground, but there's still, a lot of powerful people that think like this. And I think that's, I think it's important that that comes out, because even though it may seem really weird, it's important that people are aware that, there's powerful people with these sort of interests that are funding scientists with these ulterior motives. And I think a lot of people connected to Epstein too were also interested in transhumanism, right? Sort of this melding of human and machine and what have you, that is also of interest to, military research organizations like DARPA and things like that are, developing all this really creepy Orwellian stuff. And I think it's important that that sort of stuff gets coverage. So even though it was really surprising, to see the New York Times of all outlets reporting on that, I think it's good, because it prepares people to, that normally don't think about this stuff or look at this stuff, to be like, wow, this is a thing. And then if they decide to look into it, they'll realize, they'll see this DARPA stuff and other things I've mentioned and be like, oh, okay, I'm not into this. I'm not supporting this. Whereas if it hadn't been for this sort of mainstream coverage of this aspect, that may never have happened. Right. So even though it's weird, and some of this other stuff that's come out is super weird, I think, in my opinion anyway, it may have been a blessing in disguise to make those of us that, talk about this sort of stuff on a regular basis, have access maybe to a wider audience.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. A lot of people don't realize that a huge part of the eugenics movement started in the U.S. Margaret Sanger, who started American Birth Control League, which eventually,
that's a great example. Yeah,
she eventually turned into Planned Parenthood. I mean, she was racist, and I mean, same thing with propaganda.
Super racist.
Yeah, I mean, Edward Bernays and propaganda. Everybody thinks this stuff comes from like the Nazi Germans and during World War II, but it's like,
oh, it was here first.
Yeah, it was here first. Yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in doing your research in his background and stuff like that, because it seems like there's some holes in kind of his backstory, right? There's he goes from like working at at Dalton and the school and being a math teacher to all of a sudden having tons of money, and nobody really understands where that money comes from or whatnot. And what type of do you have any theories based on where that money was coming from and how how that whole transition happened, and also how did now there's links to possibly Mossad and all this like crazy stuff? Do you think that when do you think that happened too? Do you think he was always a part of this stuff? Because I know you go way back to the 60s, you go way back to all that stuff, and when you're connecting the dots, you realize that like, okay, he didn't just happen to fall into this, he was a part of this from the beginning.
Okay, so there's two different things there. So I'd like to delve into that separately. There's the aspect of these sort of sexual blackmail operations, and they're used by intelligence and organized crime going back really to the 40s, right?
Yeah.
And sort of the genesis of these types of networks and where they came from, and how that same nexus of organized crime and U.S. intelligence and also Israeli intelligence, or elements of Israeli intelligence anyway, we see with Epstein, right? So there's a lot of overlap in the players. But out of interest of keeping this on Epstein first, we can go through his history and talk about, his connections, because most of the attention in the media coverage has been on what he was doing pretty much more or less from the year 2000 up until his arrest in 2007. I think that's a relatively fair assessment. Well, I mean, I don't exclusively read mainstream media, but from a lot of the coverage that I've seen from there over the years, it's mainly been, the focus on stuff that really happened after the year 2000, more or less, with Epstein. But if you look into his past, there has been hints of activity that I think are very telling. So let me go back. Then you mentioned the Dalton School. Based on what's come out, and the story's changed a couple times, but based on what we know now, at least at this point anyway, is that Epstein's decision was considered unconventional. He didn't have a college degree. He was hired to work at this elite Dalton School, and he was hired by Donald Barr, father of William Barr, the current Attorney General, right? And Donald Barr had worked at the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA. A year prior to hiring Epstein, he had written a fantasy novel called Space Relations that was about sex trafficking, human trafficking and sexual slavery, which is quite odd when you consider things that were going on then. And also during the period that Epstein was hired to work at the school by Donald Barr, William Barr, his son, was working at the CIA. So that's a detail that gets left out sometimes when talking about the hiring of Epstein at the Dalton School. Not a few years after that, I forget exactly what year he leaves, but I think it's like 1978. He goes to work for Bear Stearns, even though he doesn't have any experience there really in trading or anything like that. And allegedly the reason that he gets hired at Bear Stearns is because he tutored the children of Alan or Ace of Bear Stearns, who is said to have taken a very strong personal liking in Epstein, right? And so Epstein's there for a while, and he quickly becomes really successful and rises through the ranks and becomes a partner. But in 1981, he allegedly leaves under somewhat mysterious circumstances. It's not really known why he left, but according to the Securities and Exchange Commission, he left the day after they opened an investigation to accusations of insider trading at Bear Stearns, and that insider trading accusation had to do with Seagram's, which is the company of the Bronfman family. And the Bronfman family, of course, are very tied into this organized crime network that I mentioned a little bit earlier, that sort of was involved in the genesis of these sort of sexual blackmail operations. So the allegation was that people at Bear Stearns had gotten inside info from Edgar Bronfman, who was, the owner of Seagram's during that time. So, and also would later become a member of the mega group and tied into Wexner and all of these people. So that's an interesting.
Did I lose you?
Overlap. The exact circumstances of him leaving Bear Stearns, I don't. Sorry.
No, it's all right. No, you're back. I just
Hello?
lost it for a sec. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. So, right. So the exact circumstances of when he left Bear Stearns, I don't really necessarily think are highly significant, because I think what's more important is what came after. And so from most people that have reported on Epstein's history, what happened after he left Bear Stearns is not well known, and it sort of becomes murky. Exactly what he was up to. What he was telling friends he was doing is that he described himself as a financial bounty hunter, and he was sort of doing all these services, sort of shady financial services, as it were. He claims to have been hunting down money for powerful people in government, and also hiding money for those same powerful individuals. But of course, not unlike his hedge fund years later, there was only his consulting service, there was only one well-known client, right, during this time that he had, and that was Adnan Khashoggi. So what was Adnan Khashoggi doing in the early 80s, beginning in 1981? He was beginning weapons deals through Israel to Iran, which was really the genesis of Iran-Contra. And a few years prior to 1981, Khashoggi was recruited by the Mossad. And so he was a Mossad asset, and he was also at this time working for, was also an asset to the CIA, right? So another thing that Khashoggi was doing during this time is that these arms deals that were, really a key part of Iran-Contra. The BCCI affair report that was written by John Kerry and another senator, they described Khashoggi as being the quote-unquote banker for these arms deals. So the fact that Epstein was doing financial services for Khashoggi during this time is very significant. And I also would like to point out, too, that a report in 2001 by Nigel Rosser in the Evening Standard claimed that during this period, Epstein had previously claimed to people in the 1990s that he had worked for the CIA. So if you're working for the CIA and you're working for Adnan Khashoggi during this time, it's very likely that Epstein was involved with BCCI, the CIA-linked bank. And I think that is even more possible given the fact that Bear Stearns worked directly with BCCI during this period as well, and that Bear Stearns was a broker to BCCI. And this has been pretty overlooked, and I think a main reason for that is the fact that Bear Stearns' name in connection with BCCI was not made public until like 2011, when a lot of reporting on Epstein was not going on. And this was because this actually came out from the UK government had the Sandstorm report, as it's called, that was about BCCI and its relations to the foreign governments and what the UK government knew. And a lot of names and institutions, like institutions and individuals, had been redacted, and the UK government fought tooth and nail to keep those names redacted, but they were eventually overruled, and they came out, I think, in 2011. And Bear Stearns was shown to be one of the main brokers to BCCI. So I think, of course, that's circumstantial evidence for sure, but I think the combination of those factors taken together strongly suggests that Epstein likely was doing some sort of banking with BCCI or some sort of subsidiary, given the people he was known to be involved with during that time. And I don't think that's gotten a lot of attention at all. But, we're just, people like me, right, we're just trying to put together the pieces of what was really going on here with the minimal amount of information that is available, right? So anyway, after he eventually stops this type of activity apparently in 1985, which is when he meets Leslie Wexner. And 1985 was a very interesting year for Leslie Wexner. And this is because there was this high-profile murder in 1985 in Columbus, Ohio, of a lawyer named Arthur Shapiro. Arthur Shapiro, at the time of his death, was representing Wexner's company, The Limited. The death of Arthur Shapiro prevented him from appearing at a grand jury, which was the day after he died, where he was going to be talking about tax evasion and questionable tax shelters that he had set up. And given his relationship to The Limited, it was suggested in this highly suppressed police report that Wexner had an interest in Shapiro dying. And also this police report is also significant because it links Wexner directly to organized crime interests and basically shows that The Limited, pretty much their whole logistics enterprise was deeply tied into people that were known organized crime associates. Basically, like the trucking company, which was Walsh Trucking Company. The guy that owned that was a well-known associate of the Genovese crime family, which is part of the National Crime Syndicate, which is the same syndicate that the Bronfmans were tied into and other people of the mega group were tied to as well, which I think is quite interesting there. So anyway, that happened with Wexner in 1985, and not long after that is when he meets Epstein. And officially, right, Wexner says that he was so taken with Epstein during that time because he had all these innovative ideas about how to fix Wexner's quote-unquote tangled finances, right? So to me, given the circumstances of Shapiro's death and what Epstein was doing prior to this, I think what was going on is that Epstein took sort of his shady financial shenanigans, as it were, and offered those sort of services to Wexner. And it's not long after he begins that relationship with Wexner that he meets up with Steve Hoffenberg of Tower Financial. And we know for the 2 or so years that Epstein was working with Hoffenberg, that basically Epstein was the architect of this massive Ponzi scheme that imploded in 1993, but Epstein left in 1989. Right. And in 1993, there was this criminal case that I believe eventually landed Hoffenberg 18 years in prison, but Epstein's name was mysteriously dropped from the case, suggesting that if whatever happened in 2007 was a sweetheart deal, what happened in 1993 was even more of a sweetheart deal because he didn't even get convicted. even though there was overwhelming internal evidence from Tower Financial of Epstein's intimate involvement in that fraud that I believe cost, people that had clients of Tower Financial like $450 million. It's one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. So you have all this crazy stuff going on that Epstein's involved with in the late 80s. And then fast forward to 1991 when he meets Ghislaine Maxwell, who, of course, soon after her father's death, and her father, Robert Maxwell, was a known Mossad operative, she moves to New York and she meets up with Jeffrey Epstein, and they begin a relationship. And by 1993, they're going to donor functions at the Clinton White House. And then I believe Epstein, and in between, like in 1993, was already meeting with the deputy chief of staff of the Clinton administration during that time. And that's when he really started to develop his connections to, major politicians. And then, things just start to get weird after that, because during this early 1990 period, as well as when he begins to live in this New York penthouse that was given to him by Wexner. So Wexner bought this penthouse in 1987. He bought it for $13.2 million. And he never lives in it. And even though he never lives in it, he spends millions of dollars decorating and refurbishing it. And he puts in CCTV and sort of this, what people described as like a James Bond bathroom under the stairs. And it was lined with lead to prevent electronic signals from coming in or out. And it had all this basically recording equipment of different rooms in the house, right? So given what we know that what Epstein later became involved with in that house, which was, recording powerful people in compromising positions with underage girls in this house, it's interesting that Wexner was the one that installed all of this, and then he later just gives the house to Epstein to live in. That doesn't seem very normal, does it? So he had begun to live in this house around, I believe, 1995 or so. And he was already, as I said, involved with the Clintons in 1993. 1995 is also a big year for Epstein and Wexner, because that is the year that Epstein and Wexner together, because at this time, Epstein had near complete control, basically, of Wexner's finances and was very involved in his business activities and was handling logistics for the Limited. And what happened in 1995 is that the Limited was a major factor in negotiating the relocation of Southern Air Transport from Miami, Florida, to Columbus, Ohio. And of course, Southern Air Transport is the rather infamous CIA front company, which was involved in Iran-Contra and used to be directly owned by the CIA. At the time it relocated to Columbus, it was owned by a former lawyer for the CIA, James Bastian. And allegedly, this was done. The main reason for this relocation was said to have been Wexner, because the main deal, the first flights that Southern Air Transport did in Columbus was this Hong Kong to Columbus, Ohio route on behalf of the Limited. And this raised the suspicions of several prominent people in Ohio's state government, including the Inspector General, who thought that Wexner and Epstein were working with the CIA and were involved in something. And he actually referred to this route as the Mayor Lansky run, saying that, suggesting that he thought this was some sort of organized crime smuggling operation, which it very well could have been. And so another weird thing that happens in 1995 is that Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, in a letter to Bill Clinton, well, she's Lynn Forrester still in 1995. She sends a letter to Bill Clinton saying, it was so nice to see you at Senator Ted Kennedy's house. I only had, my 15 seconds of access to talk to you. And she says she spent that short window of time with the president talking about two things, Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization. So that's kind of weird, right? Because what we know about Epstein later on is that he claims that his consultancy, where Wexner was his only known client, is that he was putting money into currency markets. And he used to brag about gaming currency markets, essentially manipulating currency. And he was known to have mainly done that from 2013 on with Deutsche Bank, which I think is interesting, considering what I mentioned earlier about Deutsche Bank's, the timing of their ending their accounts with Epstein, correlating quite closely with when he ended up being arrested. So, this is just, taking us to 1995, right? And there's already a lot of, I would say, quite bizarre connections between Epstein and just, domestically, not even getting into the Israel angle, really between, CIA-linked banks like BCCI and a CIA airline front company. I think there is a lot more to this going on than, a lot of people have reported on, obviously, in the mainstream media. I think it's kind of clear that Epstein was involved with a lot of, there were a lot of intelligence stuff. There was a lot of, he was very involved in the financial underworld, as it were, and with a lot of shadowy characters. And he was also known, sorry, I forgot to mention this, known to be an associate of several arms dealers, not just Adnan Khashoggi. Apparently, the person that introduced him to Steve Hoffenberg in 1987 was this guy, Douglas Elise, who had done an arms deal with Khashoggi with England, between England and Saudi Arabia and BAE Systems in the mid-'80s, and knew Epstein very well, and told Hoffenberg, this guy's a genius and he has no moral compass and he's so good at stuff, you should totally hire him. So it wasn't just Khashoggi, right? He was very involved with arms dealing. So I think, it's hard to know, right, exactly what he was up to because we don't have exact documentation. But I think, all of this that I've mentioned taken together makes it pretty clear that Epstein was not just, some random billionaire or some random guy that hoodwinked all these billionaires and convinced them to give him his money. I mean, there was definitely some.
Now,
hello?
Yeah, I'm here. So, do you think? So, there are some conflicting theories on what exactly Epstein was doing. Was he being used or a part of some type of blackmailing, group, blackmailing politicians or whoever, for the purpose of obviously controlling them or for favors, or was he this really rich guy who had some really crazy fetishes? Some sick fetishes. I mean, is it both? Do you have any theories on that?
Yeah, I do. I think there's two different things Epstein was doing. I think there's this financial stuff, and sort of this, airline angle potentially. I think there's that sort of side to it. And then there's the sexual blackmail operation. I think Epstein was involved in two different things, and I think they were separate. And I think the sexual blackmail operation was done with, all of this type of activity was done with like state sponsorship of someone, right? I mean, you don't do this kind of activity with such powerful people and, evade, a prosecution without having some sort of state protection when you're involved with this type of activity for so long, right? So I think it's pretty clear there was some other forces at work here. I think the sexual blackmail operation, given the involvement of Ghislaine Maxwell, I think it was a joint CIA-Mossad operation. That's just my opinion, though. But I also think that this financial thing, I'm not exactly sure if it was just for the CIA or if it was for, the CIA and Israel. It's really hard to know. But anyway, about Israel, that sort of becomes more of a factor aside from the association with Ghislaine Maxwell that begins in the early 90s, in the 2000s or late 90s, and somewhat he gets involved with, people like Alan Dershowitz, people like Ehud Barak, and people like that. And the relationship with Ehud Barak is really significant for a couple of reasons, not just because he's, prime minister. He was prime minister of Israel, but also because they became really close business associates. And also he was, Ehud Barak appears to have been somewhat close to Mark Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein's brother, who's a rather mysterious figure as well. And Ehud Barak, after Epstein's release from prison, taps him to be one of the main funders of this quite shady Israeli tech startup that is very connected to the electronic signals intelligence branch of Israeli intelligence, Unit 8200, that, has just a bunch of really creepy connections, in connections to people like Peter Thiel of Palantir was another one of the main funders. Ehud Barak is the chairman of this company, and a former commander of Unit 8200. Is on the board. A major donor to Donald Trump, Elliot Tawil, a New York real estate developer, is on the board as well. You have people from the Trump transition team on the board of advisors. You have Michael Chertoff on the board of advisors. It's just it's this weird mix of people from the U.S. National security state and Israel's in Israeli intelligence sort of coming together in this one startup. And you also have, of course, Jeffrey Epstein, who also, from all appearances, had connections to both Israeli and CIA or U.S. intelligence rather. And I think, what this company was doing, which is called Carbine, by the way, is the latest evolution in what something in sort of a joint CIA Israeli op that really goes back to the 1980s with the original theft of the Promise software, where the Promise software, yeah, right. But this is before Casolaro, right? Because he died in 1991. So the original theft of the Promise software, I think it happened in 1983, because basically Inslaw was the company that made this. They were leasing it to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice tried to buy out Inslaw and obtain control over this software. They did not succeed in buying out Inslaw, and so the decision was made to basically bankrupt them. And this was done in collusion between Earl Bryan, who was close to in Israeli intelligence, very high-ranking Israeli intelligence official, Rafi Eitan. He was also a former aide to Ronald Reagan. At the time, was an envoy to Iran. He was running he set up a rival company to Inslaw called Hadron. And he was also really good friends with Ed Meese. And Ed Meese's wife was really invested in Earl Bryan's company, heavily invested in that, and had a business interest. And that company is succeeding. And so Ed Meese, from all appearances, basically ordered payments to not be made to Inslaw anymore, bankrupting the company essentially and stealing the software. The software was taken with the approval of people at the high levels in the DOJ by Rafi Eitan, who was under an alias when he traveled to the U.S., claimed to be Dr. Ben Orr or something, and he was given a copy of the Promise software and took it to Israel. But actually the DOJ at the time, high-ranking officials anyway, knew that the real Dr. Ben Orr was not in the United States at that time, so they knew something was up and they didn't do anything. And as I mentioned, Earl Bryan had a relationship with the same guy. So what was done then is that Israeli military intelligence, Rafi Eitan was the head of this agency that doesn't exist anymore, called Lakim, and that was also the same agency that had Jonathan Pollard working for them, right? And they are the ones that put this backdoor into Promise, and it was to track, to use this to basically spy on intelligence agencies all over the world, because the software was in high demand for intelligence agencies, right? But it was also installed on banking systems all over the world to track money flows, basically in the international financial system. And this was done in collusion with the CIA and Israeli intelligence. They both had this backdoor into it for a long time. But it's not really clear if the CIA and the Mossad had Israeli intelligence had separate backdoors, or they were using the same one. That's not exactly clear. But what is clear is that this was Israeli intelligence gained access to intelligence agencies and U.S. facilities, in sensitive locations, including the Los Alamos laboratory, right? And this basically went on until the existence of the backdoor was more publicly revealed, I believe, in the early 90s. And then, that sort of dragnet gets lost. And then after that, we have companies, Israeli telecommunications companies come up, like Amdocs and Converse Infosys, right? That also later become accused of widespread espionage against U.S. government facilities in the White House. In the late 90s, going through the early 2000s, and eventually, I think the next evolution of that same type of operation is these tech startups connected to Unit 8200 in Israeli military intelligence, like Carbine, that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in, because Carbine is just one, and Carbine basically, in order for it to work, has to be installed on the electronic infrastructure of emergency service providers, and also on the smartphones of people living in that area, because it's supposed to connect you for safety purposes to emergency local service providers, and it requires access to your camera and all your data. So given the history of aggressive espionage of Israel against American targets, it's very likely that there is a backdoor here as well. So I think it's quite interesting that we're seeing Epstein being tapped to be part of a company like this. But it's also worth pointing out too, as I just mentioned, that there are several other companies like this as well that have connections to Unit 8200, and it's quite troubling actually, because there's several major tech companies, including Microsoft, for example, that have moved some of their core operations to Israel that are being run by former Unit 8200 officials. This includes Microsoft's cloud computing unit is no longer based in the United States. It's based in Israel, and it's run by a former guy from Unit 8200. And now Microsoft may be getting that JEDI Pentagon cloud computing contract. And there's been no red flags raised, apparently, about the fact that the Pentagon's cloud computing is going to be moved to another country, and that the person in charge of that unit used to work for the foreign military intelligence. You think that would sort of raise red flags at the Pentagon, but it hasn't, and I think that's quite odd. And another thing about this this broader thing that's happening is that one of the major incubators of these tech startups that involve Israeli military intelligence is called Team 8, and it's also a former commander of Unit 8200 is the head of that, and they recently hired former director of the NSA and Mike Rogers. They hired him, I think, last year. And a lot of former NSA employees and current NSA employees spoke out against it, saying the reason that he was hired was because he knows how basically U.S. infrastructure is electronic infrastructure is set up, its most vulnerable parts, and where startups can be created to sort of make this dragnet more complete. And that's coming from NSA officials. So this is some pretty wild stuff going on, and Jeffrey Epstein was right in the middle of it. And it involves Israeli military intelligence, and as I mentioned, that how Carbine's set up, it involves several big players, in U.S. tech. Like Eric Schmidt is another person involved in Team 8. I should have mentioned that, who's the former CEO of Google. So you have a lot of big name people that are sort of essentially creating this binational surveillance system, and it's quite disturbing. It doesn't get enough coverage, but hopefully the Jeffrey Epstein thing again will bring attention to this aspect as well. And that's just one of the more recent connections of Epstein to Israeli intelligence, because of course Ghislaine Maxwell, we can spend some time on her as well, with Robert Maxwell and all of that, because he was actually Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, was one of the main salesmen of this bug promise software. And was actually he and in collusion with Senator John Tower got this sold to the Los Alamos laboratory, and he was also involved in things like Israel's nuclear program, which also involved people like from the CIA, like James Jesus Angleton, and some other big players were involved in that as well. So I think ultimately what we're seeing with Epstein, right, is that the CIA and people from Israeli intelligence, a lot of times they work together, and it's not always with the blessing of the entire U.S. national security state. There's certain factions in both governments, and sometimes they come together, out of their own self-interest. And these sort of associations with these different factions in both countries, really go back to the genesis of where all this started back in the 40s, because before Israel was even founded, a lot of these same organized crime networks and sort of these oligarchs whose successors, were still around, like the Bronfmans, were really connected to the founding of the State of Israel and the arming and smuggling to Zionist paramilitaries in Palestine before Israel was created. And so this stuff goes really far back, and what we're seeing now is just how this has played out decades after the fact, with basically most of these powerful institutions never being held accountable for any of this. So it's just been one big crazy wild experiment.
Yeah. And the thing is too is that just reading your work, it's just amazing how many of the same names come up, and how many of the, again, like who would have thought that you're reading an article on Epstein, and then all of a sudden you're reading about the Iran Contras or links to Iran Contras and stuff like that. it's mind-boggling. You know, it just a lot of
Right.
the same.
Well, like again, Iran-Contra is another one of these, U.S. intelligence operations that's done with, it heavily leans on Israel. And actually, I think one of the top aides, I can't forget, I'm forgetting his name right now, but one of the top aides to Shimon Peres was actually one of the guys that came up with, Bud McFarlane in the White House to do Iran-Contra, apparently, the official story anyway, that it was sort of, dreamed up, as it were, by one official in one country together with another official in the other country, in the U.S. and in Israel. And that's also what happened with the theft of the Promise software. That scheme was really developed by Earl Bryan in a conversation with Rafi Eitan together. And so, a lot of these things going forward that we're talking about, end up being, happening in that same way. And, I honestly think these people don't really care about the national security or the nationalist aspect, because a lot of this too sort of transcends that, right? For these people, this is a business. It's not about necessarily about nationality or even loyalty. It's about money and power. Because, if you look at what Earl Bryan did with the Promise software and allowing Israeli intelligence to put a back door and putting that into sensitive U.S. U.S. facilities. I mean, I think most people would consider that like treason. But, he just saw it as an opportunity to enrich himself. And I think that's how a lot of these people think. Going back to what we mentioned earlier about how this is about wealth and power, that transcends party lines. It can also transcend national lines, especially when you consider that people like the Mega Group, who are some names that come up in this a lot, are oligarchs in both countries. The Bronfmans, for example, are Israeli oligarchs. They own, the controlling interest in Israel's largest supermarket chain and Israel's third largest bank. They own Israel's IKEA branch, so they're like oligarchs in that country. They're also oligarchs in Canada, and just in North America in general, right? So a lot of times when you start looking at the power structure of how things work, all these sort of boundaries that regular people know and recognize, for people way at the top, they don't really exist in the same way, right?
Yeah, and it's just it's wild. Is there any links to like I know Dennis Hastert or some of these other people who have a history of child molestation or in these fetishes?
Well, I didn't look at Hastert specifically, but it is worth pointing out that he came a lot of the rings, sex rings involving children that came to light in the 80s. A lot of them had to do actually with Republicans. So the Franklin scandal, for example, Larry King was a Republican operative. He was connected. To some charities that were involved with an Iran-Contra, connected to the Reagan White House, and donated heavily to causes like that, right? And then you have the Craig Spence ring, for example, too. He was a Republican lobbyist in Washington, and he is the guy that took his quote-unquote call boys to the White House, right? I think a lot of people may have seen that newspaper clipping before about how the Craig Spence ring came to light. And actually, it was Craig Spence, the investigation of Spence's ring, that led people to find the Franklin scandal ring that Larry King was running. And I think that's significant because John DeCamp, who wrote, really did the first investigation into the Franklin scandal, he said that the Spence ring and Larry King's ring, they both were part of the same umbrella group that involved the sexual trafficking and abuse of children. And we know that Craig Spence was involved in sexual blackmail as well, that he recorded. He was doing something similar to what Jeffrey Epstein was doing. But both of these guys were doing it with young boys, underage boys, from what I understand. And, of course, Epstein was doing it with underage girls. So what I think is important to point out there is that, a lot of these rings that have come to light or have sort of, come out over the years, that's not all of them. That's just a few of them, right? And, obviously during that same time period when, this umbrella group, which John DeCamp said was called Bodies by God, the Larry King ring and the Craig Spence ring, those were boys. Obviously, there was someone else running girls, underage girls during that time, right? And I think the same is true for Epstein now. Epstein was mostly only trafficking girls, right, of different ages. So I think it should be quite obvious, given the history of this, that someone was trafficking boys as well, and that person is still around because they obviously haven't gotten the attention that Epstein's gotten, right? I think there is, definitely more work needs to be done here to sort of bring the stuff to light. But what I want to point out there is that there is a known umbrella group that manages all this stuff, and a lot of these have ties to the very halls of power. So it's not surprising then that people like Dennis Hastert, are attracted to the world of politics when this type of practice is widespread. And at this point, honestly, it's systemic. And I think that is something I really want people to understand about this case, because if we view Jeffrey Epstein as an isolated event, right, there's no way to combat the systemic nature of how this is used and what this has become, right? Because this has been going on for so long, and these people have never been held accountable, that ultimately what happens is that these people just know they won't be held to account, and so they not only do they continue the activities, they expand them. And how long are people going to let this expand without doing anything about it? I just think if people aren't outraged by the fact that this is the state-sponsored exploitation and abuse of children, I don't know what will outrage people, honestly. So I don't even. Yeah, sorry. I don't even know where to go from there, but I think it's an important point to bring up.
Well, as a parent, we're both parents. Like these stories, I remember doing the podcast with on the Franklin scandal with Nick Bryan. I did a podcast with Matthew Valente or Valentines on the Open Secret documentary. And these are stories that are hard to talk about for an hour, because you do have kids, and you do hear these, especially when you get into the accounts and what they said, and eyewitnesses and people who come forward and talk about being raped and all this stuff. I mean, these are people that are never going to get their lives back. It's never going to be normal again. And they were, completely just taken advantage of. And, Epstein, in many cases, people are just kind of, they're just young girls, even the Trump quote, Epstein was known to like girls on the younger side. It's kind of like, it's kind of a big deal, and people kind of just brush that off. And it's like everybody, like you said, I think it's much bigger than just one person or a couple people. It seems like, I mean, look at what happened to DC Madam. She, of course, committed suicide, and so many of these mysterious deaths, and I'm sure a lot of people, when looking at the DC Madam story, a lot of people who are skeptical about, oh yeah, she wasn't taken out, or maybe Gary Webb or Danny Castellero or what's his name, Michael Hastings, all these journalists and people who just, maybe it was far-fetched to think that they were taken out. Now maybe they're rethinking that, and they're rethinking, is it possible? Were those people taken out? What were they unraveling that was so big that they had to be taken out?
They were unraveling the core business of the CIA and the national security state. In Gary Webb's case, it was the drug trafficking. In Castellero's case, it was that, and also the Promise software, and the banking aspect of this, the financial fraud aspect of this. So anytime you get too close to the core of this business on which this, I don't know what you want to call it, the rot, the core of the corruption in the country depends on, I mean, they totally kill people that get too close. Well, at least the people they can't smear as conspiracy theorists like me, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm never going to get invited on CNN or even Democracy Now! Or anything like that. And, because it's the people with mainstream credibility they try and, go after in that sense. Like Michael Hastings, for example, he wrote for some big name publications. People paid attention to him. Outlets like MintPress or whatever. I mean, we've already been smeared since my Epstein reporting has gotten attention, right? Specifically from people on the right, because apparently no one wanted me to mention the Mossad aspect here. Because not long after that report came out, people like Mike Cernovich were saying, anyone talking about Epstein's connections to Mossad are anti-Semitic, and there were other people on the right in those same circles making similar claims, trying to basically imply that it's anti-Semitic to criticize the Mossad, which I think is quite odd, because if you're saying that's true, then you're conflating all Jewish people with the Mossad, which I think would really insult a lot of, normal, regular Jewish people, because it's basically like saying, the CIA represents all Americans. I mean, who would make that claim? I mean, as an American, I would be offended if someone said that I'm like the CIA. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I think there's definitely been some pushback and concern, from maybe the halls of power about the story getting traction. But I think, it's really when they're afraid that the core, of their business is threatened is when they get, more aggressive in that sense. And, a lot of people like to say this is the Clinton body count, but I would like to point out, too, that the Clintons, are part of the same nexus involving Iran, Contra, or what have you. They were really involved in that with the Mina airport and all of this, and they have ties to a lot of the same people. This really transcends party, right? So, I mean, maybe the Clintons may have been involved in some of these deaths, but it really goes higher above them. The Clintons are just, one element of this criminal enterprise. They are not the heads of it. They are, really just more political, fronts, just like Trump is, or any other president ultimately is, of, they're just the public face that a lot of people recognize of this monster, as it were, this giant, corruption network or what have you, right? So it's really a body count of that bipartisan corruption that we've been talking about, and that Epstein was connected to, right? That's what the body count really is. And so I think, the Clinton body count thing, that's just another weaponization of this partisanship. This is, the body count of this corrupt network. And it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans too, like we've been talking about. So I think it's, again, important to highlight that.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing about the story, too, is that some of the stuff that people have been saying for a long time, that the elite actually believe that they're the elite, like they're the chosen ones. They're the ones who should rule the world. They're the ones who should have influence. And that there's truth to
Trump
that.
said that yesterday, didn't he? That he's the chosen one. But I think that's absolutely true, and I think these the elite, they live in a bubble. They don't even like think and view the world in a way that's even close to being analogous with the way regular people look at things, right? They're operating in a totally different. They have a totally different worldview, and to a lot of these people, regular people are just like cattle, basically, or just like pawns. I mean, that's why. For example, Ghislaine Maxwell, when she was talking about these girls that she and Epstein were abusing, she said, "Oh, they're nothing. They're trash." That's how a lot of the elites involved in this network view regular Americans. And that's why they have no qualm sending so many people to die in endless wars or bombing people abroad, as long as it allows them to expand their power and their wealth. That point, I would also like to say, too, that, talking about Iran, Contra, and this network and their ties to Epstein and all of that, this is the same network that is also responsible for the war on terror and a lot of, lying us into Iraq and a whole bunch of other things that have gone on in recent years. They're not just involved in sex trafficking or the abuse of underage kids. They're also murdering people on a massive scale around the world. And, they're doing all of these activities, including the sex trafficking. This is being done with tax dollars. If this is state sponsored, this is being done with taxpayer money. Let's remember, too, the CIA has the ability to, after that new policy in October, they can really take it from anywhere with impunity. But the black budget, they're allowed to pilfer from wherever they want, whatever agency they want, right? So they can just steal taxpayer money at whim, basically. So this is it's really crazy to consider that on another level as well. It looks like I have to go pick up my daughter.
Yeah. Sorry. But
sorry.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I was looking at the time too. I got to go pick up my kids around 6 too. I told my They're actually at my parents' house because my wife's at work. So, parent life, right? Hashtag. But it's I'm so glad you're doing the work you're doing. I mean, hopefully, I was going to ask you, I'm like, do you ever feel unsafe or like, because you're really exposing so much and you really become almost the face of this story. Does that ever concern you at all?
Well,
sorry.
No, well, I think maybe in alt media, the name, my name's gotten, a lot of circulation maybe, but I honestly think that a lot of it has, I think the people that do this sort of stuff that worry, oh, they're going to get me, and they get paranoid about it. I think those people, I mean, if you give in to sort of like fear and distress about this type of stuff, you're sort of opening yourself up to that. I mean, I don't want to get all hippy dippy or whatever, but
but you're right. You're right. Yeah.
If you give into the fear and give into the worry and you think they're going to come after you and they're going to come get you, I mean, they probably will. But
and also, isn't that one of your motivations, right? Because I mean, James Corbett gets asked that all the time, and I always hear him respond the same way. He's like, like that's exactly why he's doing what he's doing. So you're attempting not to live with that fear, not to live in a state of being afraid of everything and being afraid to be outspoken and being afraid to expose the corrupt.
Yeah.
It's that's why he's doing it, to fight back against that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's either, be complacent or do something about it. This is something I can do that I've been able to do for a few years and sort of, exposing this type of corruption and these type of things going on. I would much rather be doing that than looking at what's going on and feeling helpless, right? No one's helpless in these sort of situations. I mean, it may seem like we're against impossible odds, but really, I mean, if you give in to the despair and how big this monster looks or whatever, I mean, well, that's a big problem, and that's definitely not something we can do. Everyone can do something to expose this. I mean, even if it's as simple as talking to the people, your neighbors or your family or whatever about the stuff going on, or pointing them to information that you think is valid, or bringing up these points. I mean, really anyone can do something, because it's really important, I think, to raise awareness about what's going on, because so much of this stuff has been going on for so long, and the media has been so manipulated that so many people don't, just don't know that it's going on and don't know the reality of things. And I really hope that this is what's happened with Jeffrey Epstein is an opportunity for people that have been working on this stuff for a long time to reach more people, because it's really, at some point this has to reach critical mass. At some point this sort of stuff is on it is to give where the economy could collapse, or there could be another major war. A lot of crazy stuff could happen, and if people are uninformed about how the government's really working, they'll be suckered in to whatever the government says is the solution to that crisis, or to that crisis, right? So I think it's really important now to raise as much awareness as possible of what's going on, and expose the powers that be for what they are, and show people what they're really doing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Keep up the great work. I'll put links in the show description to MintPress News, to your Twitter account, your Facebook account, all that stuff. I know I think part 4 of your article is coming out I think sometime this weekend, if not earlier. And
yeah.
And so hopefully people check that out. It's a lot to digest, but I think it's definitely worth reading. And I think that the thing that will strike people is just how many of these names they're familiar with and keep coming up, and how they're all linked. So
right.
Hopefully I have you on again in the near future, and keep up the great work. And
hopefully next time I'll have a better internet connection.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Whitney. I really appreciate your work.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Yep. Thanks for your interest in my work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Believe in the ripple effect.